like better stuff.
All right, it's about time for us to get started. I'm going to start with 3 announcements, and I think I'm going to remember them all. First and foremost, I want to clarify a little bit about the assignment that is due on Sunday. I state in the write-up that I'm looking for about 1 page, and I am not at all a stickler for lengths of anything. When I write about how long I would think something would take, that is for me. If I were to write my own solution, my own document about this, I would expect about the level of analytical depth that I could hit in 1 page. If yours turns out to be 3/4 of a page, I don't care as long as it hits that same level of analytical depth. I give you that about 1 page so that you know about the level of analytical depth to go into to meet what I am looking for. If you want to write 4 pages, I'm not going to dock you for being over length. If you write 3/4 of a page, I'm not going to dock you for being under length. There may be a correlation between something that's submitted that's half a page and not going into the analytical depth, but it will not be because it was half a page. So just keep in mind that that's about the level of depth. If you feel like you hit that in less space, please don't write bloat to make it hit a particular length. I don't want to read the bloat. It just reads, it doesn't read well. If you find yourself wanting to go into a little bit more detail, don't feel like you need to cut that in order to hit 1 page before pictures. Again, just do not care about length. That level of analytical depth or more, feel free to submit more if that is interesting or relevant to you. Second, I know that the bookstore had a bit of a challenge with the required book, so I'm being especially understanding and lenient. I'm usually fairly understanding and lenient when it comes to due dates. Anyway, if something is going on for you, please just reach out to me. I'll work with you to make sure that we can submit at a time that works for you. What I care about is that you don't fall behind, and submitting something late means that you submit the next thing even later, which means that eventually you end up with more work to do than there is time left in the quarter. So just be in touch with me, and especially if the book hasn't come in yet or you're worried about that, please don't worry about that. Just communicate with me, let me know, and we'll come up with a plan to make sure that you're able to submit the assignment fairly. Third, we've run into an issue in the 3rd chapter of the book that you need some resources that aren't actually in the book, and they refer to something that you might not know where it is. It's a single link that is found at the very beginning of the book. If you're a part of the CS Discord, the link to that has been posted in the new 474, 475 channel in the CSCD Discord. If not, it's been on my to-do list and I haven't gotten around to it yet to post that link in Canvas. So if you have the book, that link is toward the beginning of the book. If you're not in the Discord, check Canvas or reach out to someone else in the class if that hasn't been posted quite when you're looking for it yet. Those resources do exist and they're easily accessible. Any other questions before we get started? Okay. Last time we were talking about our responsibilities as designers as an aside from talking about the layers of the elemental tetrad. So we ended with the question of how we might be able to keep in mind the responsibilities that we have. Some additional aspects to consider. We've talked about things like gaming addiction. We haven't really talked about that in here yet, but it's something to be aware of as you are designing a game. Gaming addiction is a thing. It is real. It does affect the psychology of your players. So just being aware of something like addiction in your design will be useful, because addiction is often taken advantage of in monetization in terms of mechanics that want to or make you feel like it's necessary to log into something every day to claim a daily reward. Or there's a number of different paths we've taken this that try to take extort the psychology of their users and get something from them. Predatory monetization is a part of that. Just being aware of what is predatory monetization. If the company you're working for is trying to take advantage of that, maybe you can be at least a voice of reason to say, are we sure this is exactly what we want to do? This may have some adverse effects to our users. It may affect our reputation as a company. There can also be potentially offensive topics. Make sure that as you're designing or the company you're working for is designing any game that surrounds violence, sexuality, race, culture, really any potentially offensive topic, that you're doing it in such a way that the players of your game are not going to take too much offense to at least how this is presented in terms of the game world. Finally, we can talk about unrealistic representations of reality. This just really means that if you're trying to create, let's say, a historical representation of World War II, if it's an unrealistic depiction of reality, and it feels like it's supposed to be a realistic depiction of reality, it's not some kind of alternate history type approach to the setting. If the setting states this actually happened, and what happens in the game is not what happened, that can be offensive, but it can also be misinformation that you are spreading about history. It may start to bias people's view of actual historical events that took place, or some aspect of reality. They may learn something false from your depiction that does not actually match that of reality. Questions on any of those aspects, and thinking about that at least as part of your design process? All right, last time we talked about the inscribed layer. We're going to start doing a deep dive into the inscribed layer. First and foremost, what was the inscribed layer? We remember back to yesterday. The challenge for me.
I don't even remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. Aspects of the game that exist when not being played.
Yeah, so the game as it exists when it is not being played. So elements that are directly designed and encoded by the developers. So agency and control is in the hands of the developer. You can think of it as really the game at rest. So the game as it exists while it is not being played, but is still directly designed or is part of the game as an object. So a question I might have for you is a game if it isn't being played? Interesting philosophical question, but anyone have any thoughts on whether the definition of a game as we stated it as a game still makes sense while a game is not being played?
Yeah, if we take it back to an incremental or passive game, technically, yes, things are still happening in the game and without you knowing about it.
Or is it being caught up when you launch it again? Is it simulating the time that passed since that happened? Is it actively keeping track of it as that time is elapsing, or is it not existing and then simulating that existence when you launch it again? Yeah.
I would make the argument that like you could play chess without playing chess. Like for all the people that spend time developing strategy and thinking about games and stuff like that, they're still playing the game without really playing the game.
Yeah, you can emulate the game even in your mind as you play through some existing historical game, or yeah, interesting.
As like sort of a similar thing, but when I'm playing a strategy game, when I stop and close down the game, I'll often be still thinking about it. I'll be planning my next moves the next time I boot it up. I'll be thinking about the mechanics and considering what the responses of the AI or other character will be. I'm still engaging with the mechanics of the game, even if it's not actively on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I was gonna say, there's games like, online games like Rust, for example, when you log off, you're still in the game alive, you're just sleeping and you can still be killed
yeah.
while you're not playing the game.
So the game is live, even if you're not interfacing with it. The game is more than just your interactions with the game. Yeah, so, yeah,
I would argue, even if you're not thinking, even if you're not thinking about it, even if nothing's happening in the background. It is still a game, it's still something that's been coded up or created in some way. Like. None of us are playing Monopoly in our heads right now, well, now some of us probably are. Oh, but is Monopoly still a game? Yeah.
yeah, the rules for it exist, right? But it's a game to which, to the extent of the inscribed layer. So that is one way to think about the inscribed layer, is the elements of the game that exist while it is not being played. So elements that are encoded experiences, that's one way to think about it. So as a designer, you will consider an experience that you want your player to have. You then design the game around that experience. And that design process is really the inscribed layer. It's the design that's gone into the game while the game is at rest, or even before it's been played the first time. Everything that needs to be thought of, everything that needs to be made so that the game can be played. Once the game exists in that form, then it is decoded from this encoding in the next layer, the dynamic layer, by the player while they are playing it. So now we're going to deep dive into each of the 4 elements of the tetrad at the inscribed layer. So inscribed mechanics. If you are a game designer, this is what you are doing. You are inventing the mechanics of the game, or describing the mechanics of the game as you invent that experience that you want the players to have. So what rules lead to that? You're not playing the game as you're inventing it. You probably should be once you have it to a level that you can build a prototype from. But so things like a board layout for board games, any cards you're going to use, dice, any other randomizer, any other useful piece of the game. We can break the inscribed mechanics themselves down into some levels, things like the objectives. As you're designing a game, you want to instill on the player, here is where you want to be. Now you need to figure out how to get from where we start to this objective. So you will be thinking about what are the player's goals as we do this. You'll be inventing the player relationships. So how are players related to other players? Are they related to an environment around them? Are they in competition? Are they in cooperation? How do these players interact? Do they collaborate? Do they compete? When? How? The rules, so the limits of what players can do and what they can't do as they work to get from a starting state or their current state to an objective. We talked about boundaries as being kind of the edge of a game, where the game ceases to be a game and becomes reality, or the game ceases to be defined. So for instance, you might have a visual boundary at the edge of some cliff. You have some static image of what's going on outside of that, but it is not terrain that can be traversed. What exists beyond that image? Nothing. The game doesn't extend beyond that. That's beyond the scope of the game's world. Even if you describe something in the story that takes place out there, now you have a boundary that narratively extends past there, but it's not a visitable location. So it becomes part of the definition of the boundary of the game. It's not a boundary of the story, but it's a boundary of the exploration space. Resources, anything that holds value in the game. Literally anything that holds value in a game. These could be your skills. These could be any currency, anything that holds value in the game. Any space where the game takes place. If you have a board game or a card game, it could be any table, any couch, where can the game take place? If it's a digital game, then in what space does that game take place? All of the probabilities for any uncertain outcomes in the game. So this, I call this the statistical shape of the game. If you were to break down and have a full understanding of that, maybe you could come up with an optimal way to play the game. But a lot of games have obfuscated this behind unknown information. You have to use your own player's experience to determine what is better and what is worse. The game doesn't define that for you. But as a designer, you need to know that so that you can craft that player exploration, which is a way harder problem than actually figuring out what the underlying statistics are when you're playing a game. How do you design for that exploration to feel as meaningful as possible for people who want to understand what the optimal moves are? Objectives. Going into each one of these in a little bit more detail. Objectives are more than just the final objective, meaning who wins, who loses, what ends the game, where does the game, it's every intermediate point to that. There may be some objectives that get you to the final objective. There may be some player-based objectives. I personally, let's say suddenly I'm a very competitive person. So not only do I want to win the game, but I want to make everybody else who's playing the game with me miserable. That could become a player-based objective as I am playing this game. And it defines how I'm going to be acting as I interact with the rules of the game. We can categorize different kinds of objectives based on how far into the future they are. So immediacy, so we can look into short-term goals, medium-term goals, long-term goals. We can categorize them by importance to the player. Some of those objectives are going to be more important or less important, even among different players playing the same game. Note also that if the player character is working as an avatar, you are playing some other player character, there can be a difference between what the story says the player character wants and what you, the player taking control of that player character, wants. That can be a very interesting design space as well, where you feel like the story is tugging you in one direction and you want to go in a different direction. Does the game allow for that? Should it allow for that? This is one interesting way to state of objectives. Skyrim, now this statistic is getting more and more outdated as the game's been around longer and longer, but it's probably still approximately true that about a third of the players who play Skyrim have actually finished the main storyline. According to this statistic, and with a biased view of objectives, only a third of the players have reached the objective. But I would argue that there are many other objectives that players might have while playing Skyrim. And if you talk to some of these players who haven't finished playing the game because it is so open world, so many side quests allowing you lots of player freedom, they would state, I met all of the objectives that I had when I set out to play the game. One of them just wasn't finishing the main quest of the game. I slew some dragons. I rescued some NPCs. I made a fortune. I stole everything that exists in the game. I am the only living person on this entire continent. There are lots of ways to play the game that don't go along the path that the developers intended when they wrote the main story, but that level of freedom was certainly intended by the developers, allowing you the choice of how to play the game. We can have conflicting objectives. That can make for interesting decisions. We can talk about going back to that definition of games as a series of interesting decisions. If you have objectives that do conflict with each other, especially different players wanting to reach the same objective quickly, or different players who have different objectives. We can go to the game of Mafia, for instance, where different players have different objectives within the game. And those objectives are at odds with each other. That creates the tension within the game of Mafia. We can talk about Player relationships, so. There can be 7 different types of player interaction patterns that are identified in this one case. I would argue that this is just one of many ways that you could break this down. One player playing a game versus the game itself. This is one kind of player versus environment. What is in the way of you, the single player, is what is coded by the designers. You can have multiple players against the game. This is a collaborative version of player versus environment. The multiple players versus the game could also, sorry. That could also be competitive in nature. Everyone could be a free-for-all where the goal is to defeat the game and be the last player standing, or to defeat the game the fastest, or. So we separate that from the concept of cooperative play. We can have player versus player, where we have one player against another player. This could be combat. This could be a speed-based game. This could really just be anything where we pit a player against another player. Multilateral competition or unilateral competition. You could have team versus, so multilateral being either some teams against, you can have unilateral individual players. We can compete those teams against each other, lots of different kinds of player relationships. So knowing the kind of player relationship you're striving for when you design the game it's very important for the eventual goal of what you are trying to get out of your game. How you do this is through objectives. Players can have different objectives. They can have the same objectives. You can layer those objectives. So you may have some roles where a player is the protagonist and that player is attempting to conquer the game in some capacity. You could have a competitor where you're trying to not conquer the game, now you're trying to conquer other players. A collaborator working together with other players. Someone who just exists in the game world, but not working towards a particular objective of the player or of the game as a whole. If you have a multiplayer game, especially something like a massively multiplayer online game, players may have completely different roles at different times within the same game. So you don't even necessarily have to separate, all right, the player character or someone who's playing this game has a particular role for the duration of the game. This may be in flux depending on situations. More detail on rules. Rules exist to limit what players can do. Otherwise, it is a very large free-for-all and it becomes a little bit unwieldy. So rules are the best way for the designer to force their vision of the game on the players. You want to create a space where confined in the space is something that is fun and interesting, but you don't want to confine it so much that the players don't feel like they have choice or freedom. So that's a very important balance to reach. In digital games, the actual code that you write is very similar to the rules. If you code boundaries that players cannot pass, if you make a maximum level cap, any of these are rules that prevent the player from exiting the design space that was intended. We can break down rules into a couple of different categories. We have explicit rules and implicit rules. Explicit as those that are actually stated as a rule. So if you were reading a rule book or following a tutorial, something that is stated as a rule. So roll the die and advance the number of spaces shown is an explicit rule that's told to you by the game. An implicit rule to this would be something like don't lie about the number shown on the die. Something that doesn't have to be stated, but is implicitly true to maintain the balance of the game. Boundaries in a little bit more detail, the space and time in which the game takes place. When does the game stop being played? When does the game start being played? What is inside of the game's design space? What is outside of the game's design space? Within the boundaries of your game, the game's resources have value. The rules of the game must be followed. If you are outside of the boundary of that game, then those shouldn't have value. I will give you 200 wood in this RTS if you give me an A in the class. Okay. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't have value to me because I'm not in the game with you. There's the concept of a magic circle, and the magic circle is the edge of that game. So if you want to describe the edge of a game like that, historically in the industry, we've called it the magic circle. Alternate reality games, on the other hand, kind of blur that magic circle. What is the boundary of the game? Where does the game end and reality begin? Since you're often playing in a real space, that becomes a bit blurred, and that can make for a very interesting design decision where you don't have quite as much separation between reality and the game world. We can talk in more detail about resources. We define that to be anything that has value within the game space. We can have a couple different types of those. Any assets, actual objects that you would own in the game. So for instance, equipment in Legend of Zelda, or going back to Monopoly, any actual houses, hotels, and the actual deeds to properties that you own. There are also attributes. These aren't physical objects or virtual physical objects, but they are something numerical representing something of value. So something like your health, your player level, the amount of air you have left when you're underwater. This is not something that you physically, even in the game, can reach out and touch. Unless, I guess, Link's equipment would technically be something you could reach out and touch, but that is an actual object. Here, in this case, you can't reach out and touch these objects. They are an implicit value that has, an implicit object that has value. A number, an idea, something abstract. Experience points, something else that exists, that has value, but is not something that is represented as an object. We can define spaces in the game as something that can be navigated, something that is navigable. So the board in a board game, the levels in digital games are something that can be navigated, either with a piece as you move around the board. Maybe there it represents a physical location. In a digital game, what is the space that you can walk through? What can you interact with? What can you visualize? What can you walk up to interact with? If you're going to design a space, this is one of the most important design steps in a game. Figure out what is the reason this space exists. Think about that from every element of this space. If you have a corridor leading from point A to point B, how long should you make that corridor? If people have watched Severance, for instance, the very early scene of walking down a very long hallway that takes an obscene amount of the episode's time, has a reason for that hallway to be that long, even if you don't understand it quite yet. If you're going to make the player walk down a long hallway, what is the purpose of that hallway being that long? Could it be shortened? Is it going to make the same point? So why does it exist? As well as, especially from the player's perspective, why is the player going to care about that space existing? Also think about the movement within that space. What is the flow? Can the player move through the space easily or quickly at an amount of time that is going to feel appropriate? One of the criticisms of Path of Exile 2, because I am doing a lot of playing of Path of Exile 2 and have played years of Path of Exile 1. Movement is slower in Path of Exile 2 and the areas are larger. This means that it takes a longer amount of time to go from point A to point B. That feels bad, especially players who are coming from a game where movement was easier. When you set that expectation and then change that expectation, that can be jarring to a player. That can create criticism from a player's perspective when they have an expectation of, I should be able to move from point A to point B in a certain amount of time. If there's nothing in between, then why am I doing this? So having ways to, once you've explored it once, teleport back, something like a waypoint or a checkpoint, or these can be elements of spaces that have meaning to players and prevent them from having to waste time from their own perspective. Landmarks, like I mentioned, with some way for the player to orient themselves, especially in an open world game. If you have something that is a landmark, the player doesn't need to refer to the map to know where they are. They can use how close are they and an orientation to a particular landmark. If you have something like a map, the goal should be to minimize the amount that the player needs to refer to it. If you can design the map within the space from the player's perspective, that adds to the immersion of the game. So it's something that you want to think about from a design perspective. Add those landmarks, just don't make it bland and all look the same. Landmarks really help with that, where am I within a game space? You can also talk about experiences. What is the player doing within that space? Are they doing something that is interesting, that is new, that is different from something they have done before? That might help you to design a space and spaces as the player moves from space A to space B to space C, that allows them to feel like the game is progressing. We can talk about the objective space. Does that space itself contain some short-term goals, some medium-term goals, or some long-term goals? If the player is working toward a long-term goal and they're in a space where there's no short-term goal for them to reach, it can feel like there is a long way to go before they reach that. That could be a point by which you lose some of your players. There's nothing that they're immediately working toward for that more immediate gratification. Finally, we can talk about tables. Yeah.
So if there's a game that has, no concept of moving around, like say a card game where all you've got is a set of people with a hand of cards and a discard pile in the middle, is that still a space?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more of a possibility space. What can the user be doing? How close are they to their objectives? You don't necessarily need landmarks in a card game, but maybe you want objective marks of I'm getting closer to victory. As you get closer to victory, there becomes some signal. Maybe I would use the concept of Uno to say that there is a landmark when a person shouts Uno for the first time. That really orients the rest of the players. The game is on the line. Pay attention. Something like that allows you to put a check mark in the game where the design of the game, how it feels to be playing the game changes. All right, tables, any game information? We'll be talking about this a lot because it is something that I see that is lacking in a lot of novice game designers, especially those who come from computer science, where they want to implement the game objects and they don't really want to make the design decisions. I am treating this class like you're going to be an independent developer and need to go through all of this process yourself to at least understand it. If eventually you took a position somewhere where your job was just to implement, even if you have an understanding of the mathematical balance behind a game, you can now approach higher ups, people in different departments, and start interesting conversations about the aspects of the design that they are responsible for, because you have an understanding of how that's going to affect and work with the code that you are writing. The more you understand about the whole process, the more valuable and relevant you will be on an everyday basis. Worth knowing everything. So, reasons you might design some tables. Anything related to probability. So in certain circumstances, when something happens, what is the outcome? If it's not prescribed, you want to have some table of distribution of outcomes. What is the balance of those outcomes? What's going to lead to the player having interesting decisions? What is going to lead to the player having that experience that you are trying to create for them. If it's a horror-based setting, you will want them to always be or frequently be on their toes. How do you mathematically keep them on their toes, give them some breaks, and then get them back on their toes again, most likely? What does that distribution look like within the scope of that game? That will all depend on what you are producing, what experiences you're trying to create, and having a natural understanding of what creates that will help you to be able to design your game and code your game. You can see things like relative offensive and defensive strength of two armies based on the terrain they are in. Progression is also very important. So tables about how your abilities evolve over time. How much experience do you need to level up many, many times? And any play testing data that you have. So as you start to play test your game, you're going to start gathering data about what happens within the space based on the decisions that real players make, even if it's just a prototype of the game. So you're going to want to make sure that you're gathering that data, storing that data, and you have the ability to interpret that data so that you can gauge how players feel about your game, and you can target the math behind the game to change how the player is going to feel about your game, so you can better match what you are trying to get out of the experience you're trying to create. On to inscribed aesthetics. Any questions or comments or concerns? So all of this is just stuff that exists about the game, encoded about the game without it being played. The designer's main responsibilities. Aesthetics. We talked about this being related to the 5 senses. So this is what's created by the developers that's going to have that effect. When you create something, what is going to have an aesthetic effect on the player? Any art that you create is going to be seen by the player. That art exists outside of the scope of the game and will be seen when the player plays the game. Any sound effects, music, any tactile elements of a board game, how does it feel to hold the cards? How does it feel to shuffle the cards? How does it feel to... How edible are your cards? We won't go there. Any smells or scented elements of a game. Sometimes those games can include scented elements, and taste is a little bit strange. We talked a little bit about how in a horror game, maybe you end up tasting something, or maybe your brain invents something that you perceive as a taste based on the environment that you are in. So visual aesthetic. Graphics have, of course, tremendously improved, so it's harder to really wow people with graphics, but stylized graphics still really make a huge difference. What is the graphical direction of your game? And it's beyond just the models and textures. It can include things like any box art or images, any advertising or trailers that you make, font choices for displaying information within your game, both the font type and the font size. If there's any external documentation that you use on a website that you might redirect players to, anything on that website would be seen by players and be represented within the space of someone who's curious about the game. It's one thing to just throw that information up there, but if you can find some aesthetic where all of these tie that aesthetic together, then you end up with a game's visual identity. And I like to go into games like Okami for an example of something that's just so far out there in terms of its visual aesthetic, that's what that game becomes known for. Even though it's a good game that stands on its own, it just looks and feels so different to engage visually with that game that it becomes known for it. It is its visual identity. Talk about sound, just like game graphics have improved in the last 25 years, audio quality. 8-bit soundtracks are still very interesting to me personally, but games don't really do that frequently anymore. So different platforms have different audio capabilities. On one hand, if you're designing a game for PC play or console play, we know that the speakers that people are going to be using are high quality. On the other hand, if you're designing a mobile game, the audio is often off. People are playing the game without the sound, so the game should stand with no sound. And if they do turn the sound on, the speakers on your phone are not particularly high quality. So you don't want to put a ton of effort into assuming that people are going to be listening to this like it is high quality audio. So it should stand alone if it is being played at a low bit rate. You can also think about, where are people playing a mobile game? Is there going to be background noise? If they're on public transportation and have headphones in, and those headphones don't block out a lot of the sound around you, does the game's audio work well with that background noise, or is it going to feel like is it immersion breaking to have that audio with some background noise? Yeah.
There's definitely some, at least one game I've played on the phone, on my phone that's, like a beat-based game, but definitely said, like, recommended that you use headphones.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine trying to play something like Guitar Hero on a phone. There's a reason why there aren't too many mobile Guitar Heroes. One, the control scheme is very difficult, but two, that's not the situation that you'd really want to be playing Guitar Hero in. We often mute our mobile devices, so again, the game should stand by itself without the audio. Different types of audio can be good for different outcomes. Sound effects are very good for if you need to alert the player of something happening immediately. Simple information, you're in danger, gets your attention. You now you're focused. What is the purpose of that? A sound effect. If there's a gunshot going off and you hear it in the right ear instead of the left, you know that something's happening over here. I should turn my character to figure out what's going on. So sound effects are really good for short-term information. Music has a more medium-term effect. It's best for if you are deep in an emotional cutscene. If your music is heavy metal, it is going to take away from that emotional cutscene and really feel jarring. On the other hand, if you're in the middle of an intense boss fight and the music that you're playing is very soft and melodic, it's going to feel at odds with what the player is doing. Although that's not always the case. A very memorable boss fight for me personally was Miguel in Chrono Cross, which is a very difficult encounter, but also has the same overlaying audio that was on the map above that, and it feels emotional because it's actually an emotional moment for the story, even in the middle of an intense boss fight. So that's not a hard set rule. It's something that you want to use to emphasize what it is in the medium term that's going on in the game and what you want your user to be feeling, and you really augment what you want your user to experience. On the other hand, the actual dialogue that your characters speak to each other is useful for setting the tone of a story or the tone of a particular location. You can start to be able to distinguish different locations from each other by different dialects, or if characters bring up different events in your world history. Now it feels like these places are different from each other, and that can stay memorable for the rest of the game's story. So crafting dialogue, especially when it has to deal with a character or character's progressions, can start to have longer term effects. So starting to think of what kinds of audio am I going to use for whatever it is that I'm trying to get the end user to think or feel or interact with, you can make that decision accordingly. Touch is really important in paper games. So what is it like to hold the game pieces? Do your game pieces feel cheap? Do they feel high quality? Are they going to last over time, or are they going to need to be replaced? A lot of games can be 3D printed, especially as you're working on a prototype. You don't need to go order something new and different. If you have access to a 3D printer, that can help you to at least get some prototypes before you finalize and make something higher quality that can be 3D printed. In digital games, any input device that you're using, anyone who has jumped from a familiar controller type to a not as familiar controller type can talk about really the tactile sensation of using an Xbox controller versus a PlayStation controller versus a different Nintendo. Like the GameCube controller was particularly different from any other type of controller. The 64 controller as well, yeah.
The Wii basically most
Yeah.
Nintendo controllers.
They're always trying to reinvent the wheel with this, and they've had some very big commercial success with the tactile sensation of interacting with their games. Because the DS was designed for children's hands, if you are a large adult with large hands, playing a DS can actually lead to stress on your hands. So the kinds of design decisions that go into those kinds of tactile, it is actually really important designing games for the different kinds of input devices, or you may even want to say, we recommend playing this game with a controller or with a particular kind of controller. Any motion can cause players to get carpal tunnel or controller thumb. I've actually had to bandage my hand multiple times from levels of addiction to Path of Exile, but that's embedded in the game, right? Clicks are important. We want you to feel the weight of every click. Oh, I felt the weight of every click. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say, Mario Party for Nintendo 64, when you had any mini game where you had to rotate the thumbstick.
Oh, yeah.
Get blisters in the middle of your palm.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that I would end up using my hand for that rather than trying to use a thumb for that.
Did you ever like mail Nintendo for the free glove?
I have never done that.
They do that?
Well, they got sued because people were hurting their hands by doing the spinny thing. In that specific Mario Party, and so for a while you could mail Nintendo and they had to send you like a free glove for your hand because of that lawsuit.
Nintendo Party.
Very interesting. I'd actually never heard of that. Controller rumble as well has mostly fallen out of favor, but if you can find a way to incorporate rumble or vibration to further emphasize immersion. Yeah.
I have like a particularly memorable time like with this touch stuff specifically. For Metal Gear Solid 3 on PS3, it wasn't used very much, but the buttons could be pressed analog, so you didn't have to press it down all the way, and there was a specific part of the game. So you're like sneaking around and like shooting people and stuff. And one of the actions you could do was hold somebody like hostage kind of,
Yeah.
but also shoot. But since the square button was to hold somebody and the shoot button was circle, you had to lightly press square without doing it all the way, otherwise you choke the person. And then you also have to press circle to shoot.
Gosh.
While you're also aiming.
My hand hurts just thinking about that.
I was just gonna mention the same thing. There was a Metal Gear Solid that had like that kind of tactile feedback or whatever.
Yeah.
And depending on like, I guess how you press it or release it, the snake would do something different, and I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is very important. It can even make or break the entire commercial success of your game. If it's something that you don't really consider, or becomes what your game becomes known for. It is intriguing. Just a little bit of time left. We'll see how far we can get in 1 minute. Inscribed narrative, the dramatic elements that are designed and written by you, the developer. Some components, we had the premise, which we already talked about, narrative basis. You can summarize a lot of media by just a premise. You know immediately what you're talking about. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, you immediately know, all right, I'm sitting down to do a Star Wars movie. The setting, the details of the space in which the story takes place. You could use what we talked about, that one sentence description. Here we have setting, a moisture farm on the desert planet Tatooine. Done. That is the setting, that's everything you need to know about, it gives you a lot of information in just a few words. Characters. This is anything that's told either directly or indirectly about anyone in the game world. It's best if we can find a way to make people care about the characters that we write. Finally, we have the plot. We have character, we have what the character is trying to accomplish, and we have what is in the way of the character accomplishing that objective, and that's what gives us drama. We can talk about traditional dramatics, because writing a game story is it shares a lot in common with writing any other kind of media. And we're gonna dive into the options and what you should know about traditional dramatic structures on Monday. So assignment due Sunday night, again, just let me know if you're gonna have issues submitting that on time. And I'll be understanding, just make sure that you're not falling behind, because next Sunday, there's gonna be another one of these.
My book will hopefully come in today.
If it doesn't, for some reason, or you find yourself, this is more work than I thought it was, let me know. We can get it for you.
Man,